And one of the other things that, so public services are huge income transfers. They're also employers that are generally stable and more fair, more equitable than the private sector. They also provide access to services that people wouldn't otherwise have. And they're also an economic stabilizing mechanism in a country. And in fact, I was looking at the study that Armine Yalnizyan did. I don't know if you know her. She's an economist, and she's done tremendous work on the growing gap in Canada. She did an initial report more than 10 years ago, and then a follow-up report just a few years ago in 2007. And in that report, she found that in our most recent economic boom, the benefit of the boom, in fact, we'd done better in that period leading into 2006 than we had in about the 2 decades that had preceded it. And so one would think that during that period that some of the inequities that had emerged in the previous periods would be erased. During boom times, all ships should rise, right? That people would do better. But in fact, in the last economic boom, inequality or the gap in Canada actually increased faster than it ever had before. In 2004, she found that the average earnings of the richest 10% of Canadian families raising children was 82 times that of the poorest 10%. And that's almost triple the disparity of 30 years ago, when it was around 31 times that of the poorest 10%. Everybody but the richest 10% in Canada were working more hours by 2007 than ever. In fact, the average Canadian household is clocking almost 200 hours more compared to just 9 years ago, so compared to the late 1990s. Yet only the richest 10% saw major increases in their earnings. In fact, in inflation-adjusted terms, so in real dollars, the bottom half of Canadian families raising children are earning the same or less than they did 30 years ago. And yet Canadians are producing about $1 trillion more goods and services per year than they did in 1981. And so despite producing more, despite working more hours, dramatically more hours, the bottom half of Canada's families is falling further behind than ever, the richest 10%. And although in the first 2 decades of that analysis, so from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, from the mid-80s to the mid-90s, and from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, sorry, I have that backwards again. From the mid-70s to the mid-80s and the mid-80s to the mid-90s, we saw real drops in incomes for the poorest. We saw a decline in the middle class, and the numbers of the middle class as they actually moved into the lower income brackets. And we saw growth in the upper classes. The latest figures show that the real takeoff is stagnation among the real incomes of the middle and the bottom, and an extreme growth in the incomes at the very top of the scale.